Hey everybody, my name is Maxwell Sturdivant. I'm a Ph.D. candidate at Texas A&M University in the Department of Plant Pathology and Microbiology. And today I'm excited to talk to you all about scouting for cotton diseases. So to start off with our topics for today, I'm going to begin with what should I bring to the field? What will help me in my scouting, as well as making sure I have all the things that I need while I'm out in the field. I'm then going to move into some early season diseases, cover the seedling diseases we most commonly see in cotton. I'm also going to move into some mid-season diseases. This will be our foliar and root pathogens, as well as nematodes. And then finally, we're going to talk about some conclusions and some ways to get more information if you need it. So to start off with, what should I bring to the field? Well, first and foremost, we're going to want some comfortable closed-toed shoes as we walk through the field. We want to make sure we're protected and keep safety first of mind. We then also want to bring plastic and/or paper bags for sample collection. This will help us because I know that scouts will often look at multiple fields in a day. So kind of going hand in hand with that third bullet point there, permanent marker, collecting samples that may need a laboratory diagnosis or a second look, along with marking those bags to say where you collected them, what field you were in, what the date was, can definitely help you with your record keeping and make sure that you know where you saw certain samples and where you collected them from. We'll also want a magnifying lens of some kind. This could be a hand lens or just a small magnifying glass. We're going to talk about some foliar pathogens today, where some of the lesions may look very similar. So having something to magnify those lesions may help you in your diagnosis. We also want to bring a trowel and/or a small shovel for either digging up cotton plants, look at their roots, or for soil collection if we're looking to look at nematode counts in the field. We also want to bring a camera. This will help us, again, with documentation purposes, but also will help you when you're describing diseases to either interested parties or growers, things like that. And it'll help you keep straight the diseases you're looking at in certain parts of the field. So I would recommend taking an image of the field at large, and then an image of the individual subject, being the cotton plant, and then a closer picture of the disease symptoms you're seeing when you're out in the field. And then, of course, we want to bring some knowledge of the field as well. This could be planting date, disease history for the field, weather conditions in the recent weeks and days before you got out there, as well as the susceptibility of the planted variety to certain diseases. This can help you narrow down what you might be looking at out in the field. And then lastly, we'll want to bring an ice chest to keep our samples good, as well as for water for ourselves, because I'm going to tell folks who work in cotton, you're out in the field looking at cotton plants, it's going to be hot. So I want to make sure we stay strong as we look out through the rest of the day. Okay, so moving into our early season diseases, this will cover our seedling diseases that are commonly called damping off pathogens. So when I say early season, I'm talking about the bracketed portions of that cotton disease growth cycle, the cotton growth cycle there. So seed to emergence to bud formation. And then our damping off pathogens will be our Pythium species, Rhizoctonia solani, Phalaenopsis bassicola, and our Fusarium species. So moving into our first examples of our damping off pathogens, to start off on the left side of the slide, we have our Fusarium species, such as Fusarium solani, Fusarium oxysporum, and Fusarium equisetae. These are most commonly post-emergence damping off pathogens. So when I say post-emergence, I mean that the seedling will come up out of the planted row, but it will die shortly thereafter. So those top two larger images are showing some cotton seedlings that emerged, but then quickly died because of Fusarium infection. We then see on the bottom left horizontal image some vascular discoloration caused by the Fusarium species infecting that cotton seedling. And again, at the bottom right there, we see two healthier looking cotton seedlings flanking a cotton seedling that is dying in the middle. If we move to the right side of the slide, we see damping off caused by Rhizoctonia solani. These symptoms are often called sore shin. As you can see on the right image there, we have lower stems that kind of look bruised. So that's where the sore shin nomenclature comes from. And again, this is most commonly a post-emergence damping off pathogen. And you can see there on the Rhizoctonia image on the left, we have a healthier seedling and then one that is exhibiting the damping off symptomology. So moving to two more examples of our damping off pathogens. On the left, we have Pythium species, such as P. ultimum, P. aphanerdramatum, and P. irregular. These are actually often a pre-emergence damping off pathogen or causing a seed rot. So for the image on the left, we see an uneven stand. So often Pythium will get to the cottonseed even before the seedling can get out of the soil line. So you often will just see bare spots in your planted row. Now, the image I have on the right for Pythium is a seedling that looks like it probably did emerge from the planted row, but we can see that waterlogging type symptomology at the base of the stem. So this cotton seedling would die off pretty quickly after it was taken out of the soil there. And then on the right side of the slide, we see blackroot symptomology caused by Phalaenopsis basicola. This is most commonly a post-emergent stamping off pathogen, and the symptomology speaks for itself. We see at the lower stem and the roots there, this blackening of the tissue that will lead to the death of the cotton seedling. So what are we going to do about these early season pathogens, or what can we do about them? Well, in terms of control, the first thing that's recommended is to plant into warm soil. That would be greater than 65 degrees Fahrenheit. We can also ensure that we have good soil drainage, raised beds if possible. There are also some seed treatment fungicides that can be used to help prevent the infection by these pathogens. There's also an in-furrow fungicide application regimen that can be followed. And this has a limited application, but we could solarize the soil to help reduce the inoculum load. But again, in terms of tarping your rows, if you have a large operation, this would not be economical. Okay, so before we move into our mid-season diseases, I'm going to start throwing around a lot of terms, talking about different symptoms and signs of pathogens. So real quickly, I want to talk about what the difference between a symptom and a sign is. So as far as symptoms go, this is the plant's reaction to the infection or stress that's being caused by a pathogen. And on the other hand, signs are the physical presence of the pathogen itself. So in terms of some examples of symptoms, this could be lesions, yellowing or chlorosis, blackening or rotting of tissue or necrosis, stunting, wilting, and other things along those lines. Examples of signs could be spores, fungal growth, or a physical nematode itself, things that are actually the pathogen that you can see. So as some examples here at the bottom of the slide, at the far left, we see a cotton plant that has some wilting going on based on an infection by Fusarium. So this would be a symptom. And then to the right of that image, we have hyphal growth on the surface of a cotton root caused by a pathogen that causes cotton root rot, we're going to talk about later. That would be a sign. It's the physical presence of the fungus itself. To the right of that image, we have some stunted cotton plants caused by a viral disease. This would be a symptom. And on the right, I have two images starred. That's just for us to keep in the back of our minds. We're going to talk a little bit more about it later, but these are actually symptomology on cotton leaves caused by abiotic factors. So these are things that are not caused by pathogens, but just by weather conditions, injury, things like that. So that top image is actually just a natural chimera, that yellowing in the cotton leaf. So that's not caused by a disease. And that bottom image is symptomology caused by a nutrient deficiency, in this case, potassium. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of these symptoms we see may actually not be from a pathogen. It could be just because of environmental conditions. Okay, so as an overview of our mid-season diseases, we're going to break it up into three categories. We have foliar diseases, root diseases, and then nematodes. So for our foliar diseases, we're going to talk about target spot, areolate mildew, southwestern cotton rust, bacterial blight, and some other defoliating pathogens you may see out in the field. For our root diseases, we're going to see Fusarium and Verticillium wilt, as well as cotton root rot. And then the four nematodes that we're going to talk about today are root knot, reniform, lance, and sting. And again, if I could direct your attention to the cotton growth stages at the base of the slide there, we're looking at that bracketed section where we have flowering, bull set, and then bull fill. To start off, our first foliar pathogen is going to be target spot or Coronospora cassicola. So these are leaf spots that are usually found close to the base of the plant. The reason it's called target spot is because the image on the left shows these concentric rings within the brown lesion, and the leaf itself usually stays this nice green color, and the defoliation may occur at the base of the plant in the lower canopy. I also want to direct your attention to the right side of the slide where these are also lesions caused by target spot, but as you can see, they aren't quite as concentric as the ones on the left. So there's a bit of variation of what you can see out in the field. On that right picture at the top, I have some examples of Coranospora spores. So obviously this would be a laboratory diagnosis if we're looking at the spores underneath the microscope. Those kind of wider club-shaped spores will be important when I talk about another foliar pathogen in a moment here that is hard to differentiate from target spot, but its spores are very different. So when might we see target spot? What are the conducive conditions here? Well, dense canopies with prolonged periods of humidity can help foster disease. And then the fungus can survive on cotton debris. So if you have a continuous cotton field, they may be more affected by target spot. And briefly, what can we do about target spot, either in season or for the next season if we see it? We can rotate to a non-host, commonly corn. We could plant a high-yielding, stable cotton variety to help kind of outpace the potential yield losses caused by this disease to kind of offset the defoliation it may cause. We can avoid excess nitrogen fertilization. We can look for rank cotton growth. So by that, I mean cotton that may have not had a plant growth regulator applied to it, or maybe was missed by the application made. Target spot may be concentrated in those rank cotton growths around the field. And last but not least, we could apply fungicides. In the case of dense canopies, like I mentioned, is conducive for this disease. Fungicide application may not be as effective because the fungicide may not go deep into the canopy when you apply it overhead. But if we are applying fungicides, we could apply at the first and third week of bloom in the southeastern portion of the cotton belt, or the third to fourth week of bloom in the mid-south or our Texas growing regions. Some examples of some fungicides could be Headline, Preaxor, Quadris, or some of our other azoxystrobin products. Okay, so moving into an important emerging pathogen in the cotton growing region of the United States is areolate mildew. This is Ramularia gossipii. That's the name of the fungus that causes this disease. So starting on the left side of the slide, we have lesions that appear in the lower canopy first and are usually restricted by a major leaf vein. As these lesions progress, they can look kind of like a disease called bacterial blight. We're going to talk about in a moment here. And then premature defoliation can occur. So those are the symptoms there on the left side of the slide. In the middle here, we see something that's very indicative of areolate mildew compared to our other foliar pathogens, are how the infected leaves have a slightly yellow appearance on top and then have a white mildew growth at the bottom. And that's what you'll be looking for. You flip over the side of that leaf and look at the bottom to see for this white mildew growth. And again, what are our conducive conditions for this disease? Well, dense canopies with prolonged periods of humidity, just like target spot. And once again, the fungus can survive on cotton debris, so continuous cotton fields may be more effective. Right now, I mentioned this is an emerging disease. We're seeing it across much of the cotton belt. It has not crept into Texas yet, but right now the southeast epicenter for this disease will be Georgia and Alabama. So what can we do about areolate mildew? Well, there are resistant varieties that can be planted. We can incorporate plant residue into the field as well as use a crop rotation program. And then once again, we can apply fungicides. So you're going to want to start scouting for this disease before and at first bloom. And if you see it, apply the azoxystrobin or pyraclostrobin products at this growth stage. You'll also look to make another application at third bloom. So in terms of when to apply fungicide, we're kind of sitting in that first to third bloom stages of the cotton plant. And if available, I know that some extension services, especially in the state of Georgia, will have sentinel plots that will have scouting going on in them. So if they see the disease in their sentinel plots, they'll alert the local growers, and that's when you can start making decisions on fungicide applications. Okay, so here's one for our southwestern cotton growers. So this is southwestern cotton rust caused by Puccinia caccabat. So this disease first appears as yellow lesions on the upper side of the leaf that progress to an orange colored lesion on the bottom side of the leaf. So this orange color on the bottom side of the leaf is very indicative of a rust. And these are actually fungal spores. So that would be a sign of the disease. These yellow spores protrude from the base of the leaf. You can actually touch the bottom of the leaf and they'll come off on your fingers. And then what are the conducive conditions for this? Well, rainfall of an inch or more, along with 12 hours of high humidity. And the image on the left are those orange spores I was talking about. But the image on the right is actually not cotton. That is grama grass. Now, grama grass is important for what we're going to be talking about here on the next slide. So in terms of controlling southwestern cotton rust, we'll want to begin by scouting the grama grasses in the area to see if the disease is showing up there first. So you'd go out and see if there's a rust in your grama grass. And then from there, if the weather conditions are favorable and the disease has been seen in the grama grass, a preventative fungicide application is recommended. So we can have our azoxystrobin or our pyraclostrobin products. At the bottom left here of the slide, we just see an example of grama grass in Texas. And once again, the region where we may see this disease, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And even though I have the whole state of Texas highlighted there, it's really only going to be in far west Texas in our Trans-Pecos region in the El Paso part of the state. Moving on to another foliar disease, bacterial blight. This is caused by the bacteria Xanthomonas citrii, pathovirus malvacearum. So there's several names for this disease. It could also be known as black arm or angular leaf spot. These lesions start as water-soaked and small, and then they progress to larger angular spots that are constrained by leaf veins. So these lesions, as they advance, can exhibit this shot hold appearance in which portions of the leaf tissue fall out from the bottom and leave little holes throughout the leaf. There can also be sunken and water-soaked lesions on the bolls themselves. So if I can direct your attention to the images here, on the far left, we see some necrosis going on along the vein of the cotton leaf caused by bacterial blight. In the center top, we see this black arm symptomology that I mentioned when describing the disease initially. Here is a water-soaked lesion on a boll. On the right, we have the angular leaf spots that are caused by the pathogen. And on our far right, again, we see that along the vein, the symptoms caused by the bacteria. So what are conducive conditions? Well, periods of moisture and humidity coupled with susceptible varieties. So the susceptible varieties is a big part of this discussion. You'll be looking to have varieties that are not susceptible to this disease as an insurance so you don't see this pop up in your field in wet years. When it comes to controlling bacterial blight, first and foremost, we're going to want to look for resistant cultivars. So check your cultivar, make sure you have bacterial blight resistance in there. In terms of some of the cultural practices we could follow to help reduce our bacterial blight incidence in the field would be to incorporate that crop residue into the soil to reduce the inoculum load on any kind of plant residue that may be on the surface of the soil prior to planting. Okay, so our last set of foliar diseases here we're going to talk about are some of these other defoliating pathogens. So I put them in this group because they are pathogens that you may see pop up in your cotton field, but may not have an impact on your yield, so may not require any kind of action. They are also hard to distinguish from one another. So that's why I put some of these images side by side here, and still it may be hard to tell them apart, but I'll talk about a few things you might be looking for to help differentiate these pathogens. So on the far left, we have Cercospora leaf spot. These will start as red lesions that progress to large white to light brown lesions that are circular. And like I mentioned earlier when we were talking about target spot, this Cercospora leaf spot can be hard to differentiate from target spot, but the spores can be diagnostic. So if you think back to target spot, I talked about those more club-shaped spores. Well, here at the bottom right of the Cercospora leaf spot image, we see one of the more whip-like long spores that has the lines in them, but is longer and has more of a longer tail there at the end that is different from the Coronospora species that cause target leaf spot. So now moving to the center here, we have Stemphylium leaf spot. So these lesions are about 2 centimeters in diameter. They're circular and they're brown with concentric zones. Now, these older lesions will turn white in the center and display perhaps this shot hold appearance that we talked about with bacterial blight. A difference here is the lesions form in the upper canopy and then start at the leaf margin and move inwards. So if we compare this to target leaf spot, which usually begins at the base of the canopy, Stemphylium leaf spot usually starts at the top of the canopy. So that's something to look for there. Also, Stemphylium is much more common in the Southeast than, say, our Mid-South and Texas growing regions. And finally, on the right, we have Alternaria leaf spot. So these lesions are found on older leaves, and they are brown with purple margins. The necrotic tissue may coalesce, and the older lesions may become gray. And again, we may have this shot hold appearance with parts of the leaf falling through and creating holes in the leaf. Now, this alternaria leaf spot is more common in Texas and the Mid-South growing regions. Okay, so in terms of controlling these other defoliating pathogens I've kind of lumped together, we can maintain our plant vigor and encourage proper fertility. So if possible, and I realize especially some of the folks here in Texas growing their cotton on dry land, preventing drought stress may be very hard, but if possible, try to prevent drought stress. And then also fostering good soil fertility, especially potassium, making sure we have good potassium levels in our soils. And there are fungicides out there that can control these pathogens in extreme situations, but they're usually not economical when it comes to the cost benefit with the yield loss they cause. Okay, so moving to our mid-season root diseases, we're going to start with comparing Fusarium and Verticillium wilt. So on the left side of the slide, we see Fusarium wilt, which is often found in association with root knot nematodes because these nematodes create a wound site for the fungus to enter. However, there are some kinds of Fusarium that do not need nematodes. For example, there's a Fusarium oxysporum species, often called FOV4, we find in far west Texas that does not require the presence of nematodes. So just keep that in mind if you're in the far western portions of Texas looking at cotton. So these symptoms include wilting, stunting, yellowing, and dead plants, along with discoloration of the vasculature. So we see here on the left a cotton plant that is going down from a Fusarium wilt. We see some chlorosis and some wilting, of course. And then to the right of that, we have some discoloration of the vasculature shown. Now, comparing this to Verticillium wilt, these symptoms can be seen in seedlings. However, it is most prominent after flowering. So that's why I've had it here in the mid-season diseases. These symptoms include, again, innervanal chlorosis and or necrosis, stunting, defoliation, and discoloration of the root system. So a couple of differences here. We see in Verticillium wilt, we really want to focus on the wilt side of the symptomology, whereas in Fusarium, we may see more yellowing or chlorotic leaf tissue based on infection. And of course, looking at the discoloration of the root system, we see more discoloration throughout the root system for Verticillium as opposed to Fusarium, which is more concentrated in the vasculature itself for the discoloration. Now, when it comes to control of these pathogens, well, there may be some resistance out there. We could do crop rotation, but usually fungicides are not economical for controlling these diseases. Now, for our next mid-season root pathogen, we're going to talk about cotton root rot. So if I could direct your attention to the bottom of the slide, we see that this is, again, for our southwestern cotton growers. We have Texas, Oklahoma, southern New Mexico, as well as Arizona affected by this pathogen. So this pathogen is the fungus Bimatotrichopsis omnivora. It causes these patches in the field of dead cotton plants. So if you see this middle picture, we see just taken from the side of the road, a cotton root rot patch advancing through the field. On the left, we see the lesion that can be exposed by cutting away a few layers of the cotton stem and roots to see the advancing lesion up towards the stem. And on the far right, we see perhaps you call it the hyperlocality of this disease, where there's a seemingly healthy cotton plant to the right next to some cotton plants that have died off very quickly. So another note to make about this disease is that from infection to death, it can take down a cotton plant in about 3 days. The leaves stay attached to the plant, but they obviously die. And in terms of controlling this pathogen, well, the only option as of right now would be the flutriafol fungicide called TopGuard. That's undergoing a name change to Xyway, which can be applied at planting. Okay, so moving on to our nematode portion of the talk, we're going to begin with our root knot nematode, which is Meloidogyne incognita. So on the left side here, you can see the uneven stand caused by a root knot nematode, some stunting, again, some uneven stand. But the best thing you could do to see if you have root knot nematodes in your field is to dig up a couple plants and look for these root galls that I have on the right. So as the name suggests, these root knot nematodes will cause galling on the root system, and that can be pretty diagnostic for looking at a nematode disease in the field. Moving to our next nematode, this is the reniform nematode. It is Rhodolinclus reniformis. So to start on the left side of the slide, we have this kind of characteristic up and down pattern you may see in the field. So you'll have shorter plants, then taller plants, then shorter plants in an oval-shaped patch in the field. So that's what you would be looking for reniform nematode. Moving to the right of those cotton plants, we see the reniform nematode itself on a cotton root. And then moving all the way to the right of the slide, we see some foliar symptoms that may not always be present. So I want to stress that you don't need to see these foliar symptoms to have a reniform nematode issue in your field, but you may see them, and that could help you with your diagnosis. So the last two nematodes we're going to talk about here, we have our lance and our sting nematodes. So on the left side of the slide, we see an example of the Columbia lance nematode, which causes our roots to be smaller than normal, but no galls are formed. And the taproot does not advance as you might expect in a healthy cotton plant. And these nematodes are found in sandy soils, ones that have greater than 80% sand content. On the right side of the slide, we see a very extreme example of some damage caused by the sting nematode. This causes root tips to be pruned, and it, of course, limits the plant's ability to uptake nutrients and water when this happens. And these nematodes, the sting nematode, are found in very sandy soils, so greater than 85% sand content for these soils. And I'm talking about the sand content. You might imagine, well, both of these nematodes are mainly found in the Carolinas, Georgia, and Florida due to the high sand preference of these nematodes. So here I want to talk about sampling for nematodes. This is very important. I've been talking about these nematode symptoms. You might be saying to yourself, well, these are all pretty general, which is very true. We have stunting, yellowing, that could be a lot of things. So if you think you have a nematode problem and you don't necessarily have really nice root galling to tell you it's perhaps a root knot nematode, sampling is very important to see if you have high nematode counts in your field that may be causing the symptoms that you're seeing. So when you're taking samples for nematodes, you want to scrape off the top few inches of soil and then collect soil from about 8 to 10 inches deep. You also want to dig into the fine roots and include some of that in your sample. You want to take samples from multiple locations in the field. So take samples from healthy plants as well as plants that do not look as healthy, that are displaying the symptoms that you're concerned about. And at the end of the sampling period, you're going to want to have about a pint of soil in a plastic bag. If you're using a soil probe, it'd be about 15 cores, but if you're just using a gardening trowel or a small shovel, just give it your best bet on what about a pint of soil would be. So along the bottom here, just have some general images of nematode sampling. On the left, we have somebody in a planted cotton row scraping off the top layer of soil, getting ready to take some soil samples. In the middle, we have the nematode soil in a little baiting apparatus that is on the right, where we have a sieve and something at the bottom to catch the nematodes that'll go down through that sieve and then collect in the water that's at the base there. And then from there, we can count the number of nematodes to estimate our populations in the field. So what can we do to control nematodes? Well, first and foremost, we want to try to prevent the spread of nematodes to new uninfested fields. So cleaning your equipment and implements as you go between fields could be important if you know you have a high nematode population in one field, but not in the other. When it comes to crop rotation, we could do a 1 to 2 year rotation. For root knot nematodes, we could rotate to either peanut or sesame. And for reniform nematodes, we could rotate to either corn, sorghum, or peanut. All three of those could be effective. When it comes to our chemical control, there are several nematicides out there we could try. For pre-plant, we could use Telone 2. For at-planting in-furrow applications, we could do Vellum or AgLogic. Post-planting, we could do Vidate or AgLogic. And there are also seed treatments that could work as well. Now at the bottom here is one I want to stress, there are nematode-resistant cotton varieties. And these can be a real game changer for some folks where it works for their preferred maturity groups. So there are several root knot nematode and reniform-resistant cotton varieties that can be utilized to help control some of our nematode diseases in the field. Okay, so with that, I'd like to finish up with some conclusions. So to begin, what are the goals of scouting? At the base level, we just want to gain more knowledge about a field or a region that could help us inform management decisions both for this season and next. And I also want to give the big caveat that some things may need a lab diagnosis. So some issues may be abiotic, some things may be hard to differentiate. If it is a pathogen, it could be hard to differentiate between which pathogen it is out in the field. And this kind of ties into my last point here. If you need more information, I would highly recommend contacting your local extension service or their website or your plant diagnostic clinic in the area. There's a lot of really well-knowledged extension professionals at all of the land-grant universities around the country. So getting more information from those folks can be a great resource for you. You can also look at the Crop Protection Network, and there's the website there. This can be a great resource looking at yield loss estimators for certain diseases and kind of give you an idea of what is most prevalent in your region. And then lastly, if you'd like to get in contact with me for more information or any questions or comments about my presentation, please feel free to reach out. I love talking about cotton and plant pathogens in general. So my email is linked there, as well as my Twitter handle are two ways to get in contact with me. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody for their attention to this presentation, and happy scouting.